On the information I have, I agree with Secretary Pompeo's assessment. It certainly appears to be the Russians, but I'm not going to discuss it beyond that.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya Rivera. Welcome back to CBSN. Outgoing Attorney General William Barr says he believes Russia is responsible for that major cyber attack on U.S. government institutions. U.S. officials say the attack was discovered last week. The extent of the damage is still unknown. At least 7 government agencies are impacted, including the State, Energy, Treasury, and Homeland Security departments. President Trump appears to be downplaying the attack, even contradicting his own administration. Mr. Trump is claiming, without evidence, China is behind the hack. CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge has been closely following this developing story. Hi, Catherine. So the president says Beijing is behind these attacks. Secretary of State Pompeo and Attorney General Barr say this has the Kremlin's fingerprints. So tell us the facts. What do we know?
Well, based on our reporting here at CBS News, Tanya, all indicators point to Russian intelligence and a group called the SVR. They're foreign intelligence, civilian intelligence, kind of like our CIA. There's a separate intelligence entity with the Russians known as the GRU, and that's military. The phrase that's really caught my attention in our conversations is talking about Russia as being the main actor. And a former senior cybersecurity official told me it does appear that there were 2 trapdoors, at least, that were inserted. So the question is whether it was all done by Russian operatives, whether it had been contracted out to a third party, like a criminal group, giving them plausible deniability, or if, in fact, there was another adversary that was seeking to exploit the same vulnerability with the SolarWinds software.
So, Catherine, a bipartisan congressional report from 2019 found that there were, quote, cybersecurity vulnerabilities and weaknesses in many of our federal agencies. That includes the Department of Homeland Security and State Department. So is it safe to say that we knew something like this was bound to happen? And what might Congress do in 2021 to address this?
Well, the expectation in 2021, Tanya, is that there will be congressional hearings and they'll try and craft some new legislation. But what we've really seen play out here, unfortunately, I think really goes to the warnings that you've just cited, which is that you can do everything possible to defend and secure the federal government networks, but they're only as strong as the weakest link. And the weakest link here is what's called supply chain integrity and security. And that's a fancy way of saying that when they were getting software from an outside vendor, that's where the weakness was, and that's what was exploited. So even though federal systems may have been very secure after billions of dollars of investment, they were only as secure as that weak link with that supply chain software.
That's right. And Catherine, incoming White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain said on Face the Nation Sunday that President-elect Biden's response to this hack would go beyond just sanctions. What retaliatory options does the incoming administration have?
Well, I think to set the table, it's important for folks at home to know that this is still believed to be the largest cyber espionage campaign in U.S. history, and that speaks to the depth and the breadth of the compromise, not only in government systems, but also in the private sector. So based on my experience, and I've worked in this area for 2 decades, there are a number of planning options, if you will, or menu options for any administration. Some are very obvious, like sanctions and expulsions. Some are not so obvious, like a cyber offensive, a cyber attack on the systems that are valuable to the government that was behind it. And this is called classic gray zone warfare. The gray zone is this battle space between peace and conventional warfare. And what we're seeing play out right now is classic gray zone warfare involving this massive cyber attack. Bottom line, for the next administration, it will be very important to have a naming and shaming of the adversary, then very public consequences, for example, as I mentioned, sanctions and expulsions, but then also the covert consequences, perhaps even a cyber offensive. But the bottom line with that is that it would be a further escalation, and that's really the calculation. Do they want to further escalate really as they come in the door and they're just getting their footing.
Right, and I think, Catherine, it's worth reminding Americans who, who hear this story and it sounds very abstract to them, cyber warfare and cyber attacks. But, these sorts of things can have very real consequences. Entire electrical grids can be taken down, banking systems can collapse. There's all sorts of actual real world consequences. So if this starts to escalate,
that's right.
I think that part of it needs to be understood as well, correct? And
just one little point on that. The expectation is that when this adversary got into our systems, they planted malware with the anticipation that if there was some sort of cyber retaliation for this attack, they could set that off as well, sort of a whole new branch of fireworks, if you will. So they're booby traps they anticipate within our systems for that.
It's very treacherous. And Catherine, Attorney General William Barr earlier today took questions from reporters at a news conference after announcing new charges against the bomb maker in the 1988 Pan Am bombing. So before we get to that, though, Mr. Barr made some pretty big headlines on a host of topics, and you were there. So what did we learn?
Well, the Attorney General said that everything that he understands points to Russia, not China, as being behind the cyber attack. So that puts him sort of firmly in line with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in his assessment of the nation state that was behind it. He was also asked whether he thought the investigations into Hunter Biden warranted a special counsel. He said not at this point. He was asked whether he thought an incoming administration would try and tamp down the current investigation by special counsel John Durham into the origins of the FBI's Russia probe in 2016. He said a responsible administration would not do so. And then if I could, he had some comments about Lockerbie. This had personal significance to the Attorney General because he worked that investigation and really got to know the families that were impacted, not only the American families, but also those in Scotland who were killed on the ground. And it's more than 3 decades since that attack. The anniversary is today, and the target was Americans, and especially those students from Syracuse University. And he said that it was important to bring it full circle. In his view, not enough had been done at the time to bring them to justice. And it's really amazing when you consider this is still believed to be, if not the largest, one of the largest crime scenes in history, because the extent to which the debris was shattered over Scotland and then brought back together and pieced together in order to find the cassette recorder that ultimately led them to this bomb maker who's held by the Libyan authorities. And he said at the news conference he was optimistic that this individual would be provided to the United States for prosecution.
A long journey. All right. Well, Catherine Herridge, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.